Pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 1st, 2022, the committee is commencing its study of crowdfunding platforms and extremism financing. With us today from the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada, Barry McKillop, Deputy Director, Intelligence, and Annette Ryan, Deputy Director, Partnership, Policy, and Analysis. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. Witnesses may choose to share their time with other witnesses if they wish. Welcome to you. And I now invite Mr. McKillop to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for inviting us to address the committee today.
I would like to briefly speak about FinTRAC's mandate under the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act, and the valuable role we play in helping to protect Canadians and Canada's economy. Mr. Chair, FinTRAC's mandate is to facilitate the detection, prevention, and deterrence of money laundering and the financing of terrorist activities.
Federal departments and agencies that play a key role in Canada's anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing regime. FinTRAC was established as an administrative financial intelligence unit and not a law enforcement or investigative agency. We do not have the authority to freeze or seize funds or cancel or delay financial transactions. This was done very deliberately by the Parliament of Canada to ensure that we would have access to the information needed to support the money laundering and terrorist financing investigations of Canada's police, law enforcement, and national security agencies while protecting the privacy of Canadians. As Canada's anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing regulator, FinTRAC is responsible for ensuring the compliance of thousands of businesses with requirements under the Act, including financial entities, casinos, money service businesses, real estate, and others. I will note that crowdfunding sites are not a regulated business sector under the Act. However, when these sites transit with or through businesses subject to the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act and its regulations, these financial transactions would be covered under the Act. As part of their obligations, businesses subject to the Act are required to establish a compliance program, identify clients, keep records, and report certain types of financial transactions to FinTRAC, including international electronic funds transfers totaling 10,000 or more in a 24-hour period, large virtual currency transactions totaling 10,000 or more in a 24-hour period, and suspicious transactions which have no monetary threshold for reporting. Mr. Chair, compliance with the broader legislative and regulatory obligations provides important measures for deterring criminals and terrorists from operating within Canada's legitimate economy. Compliance with the legislation ensures that FinTRAC receives the information that we need to generate financial intelligence for enforcement and national security agencies to act upon. The reports that we receive from Canadian businesses are analyzed and assessed. And when we have reasonable grounds to suspect that financial intelligence would be relevant to investigating or prosecuting a money laundering offense or a terrorist activity financing offense, FinTRAC generates a financial intelligence disclosure for Canada's police, law enforcement, and national security agencies. Under subsection 55(1) of the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act, FinTRAC is expressly prohibited from discussing any information that we receive or any financial intelligence that we disclose to Canada's police, law enforcement, and national security agencies. What I can say, however, is that our financial intelligence is valued by those agencies, many of whom have told us that they will not start a major project-level investigation without seeking out our financial intelligence. Last year, we provided more than 2,000 disclosures of actionable financial intelligence in support of investigations related to money laundering, terrorist financing, and threats to the security of Canada. Since becoming operational in 2001, the Centre has provided more than 22,000 financial intelligence disclosures to Canada's police, law enforcement, national security agencies, as well as our international partners. Our disclosures include financial information on an individual or a network of individuals or entities suspected to be involved in money laundering or the financing of terrorist activities. They can make links between individuals and businesses that have not been identified in an investigation and can help investigators refine the scope of their cases or shift their sights to different targets. Our financial intelligence is often used by law enforcement agencies to put together affidavits to obtain search warrants and production orders. Our financial intelligence can also be used to identify proceeds of crime and advance the government's knowledge of the financial dimensions of certain crimes and threats, including organized crime and terrorism. Last year, our financial intelligence contributed to 376 major resource-intensive investigations and many hundreds of other individual investigations at the municipal, provincial, federal levels across the country, as well as international investigations.
Thank you very much. Unless you have something that you think is indispensable, and you got 10 seconds.
No, sir. C'est maintenant avec plaisir que je répondrai aux
It will be my pleasure to answer the questions of the committee.
Opportunities. Thank you. Now we begin a round of questions, and to lead off, I would invite Mr. Lloyd to use his 6 minutes. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witness for attending. Wanted to ask the witness, is there a objective threshold that you employ to determine, when something is money laundering and when something is a terrorist activity? My concern is, the word terrorism, can be thrown around somewhat carelessly. And I just want to know, what is your objective standard for what does constitute those activities? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, we use, when we arrive at our threshold to suspect that a certain transaction would be relevant to a money laundering or terrorist activity financing investigation, we have a number of indicators that we have developed over the years based on our intelligence. We've also built on indicators that are published and are in existence through the FATF, which is the Financial Action Task Force, as well as AIGMONT, which is a group of financial intelligence units internationally. We also have indicators that we have developed with our domestic and international partners related to money laundering. As most of you likely know, money laundering is the result and the use of proceeds of crime. So typically a crime is committed, and we would see often transactions that are linked to predicate of crimes similar to human trafficking, for example, or drug trafficking or child sexual exploitation material on the internet and the purchase of that. The commission of those predicate crimes and then the movement of money tends to be the lead and the indicator for money laundering. So we do have a number of indicators, and we identify those indicators when we do disclosures to assist law enforcement in understanding why we're giving them the intelligence that we are providing them.
And what about for terrorism, Mr. McKillop?
Thank you, sir. For terrorist financing as well, we have a number of indicators that we have developed. We have also shared some of those. We have shared those indicators with our reporting entities as well. And the indicators assist both on the money laundering and the terrorist activity financing side. They assist our reporting entities in identifying the transactions that may be associated with those. So they are specific, actionable intelligence indicators that can be used to identify suspicious transactions.
Thank you. I'm sure there's a role for legislators, in a sort of creating a framework, as you said, based on the criteria that you use. But do you think it's appropriate, for politicians to, call on FinTRAC to investigate groups as they come up? Is that something that you guys have a mandate to do and that you think would be appropriate to do, or do you think that following your own mandates and guidelines is the best way to conduct your activities?
Thank you very much for the question. Our mandate is, and we were set up very, very specifically not to be an investigative unit. And it's very important to understand that the reports that we receive from our reporting entity under the PCML TFA are warrantless reports that we receive. For example, the threshold reports of $10,000 in or out of Canada, or anything above $10,000, for example, the vast majority of those that we receive are on legitimate Canadians doing legitimate business or legitimate organizations sending money for business purposes. And we have a role in protecting the privacy of that. We are not an investigative agency. Otherwise, we would not be able to receive the reports that we receive, because we provide the intelligence to law enforcement. Law enforcement will then use that as part of their investigation to develop and obtain the evidence that they need to go forward in court. We are also set up as an independent agency, an arm's length agency from the government. It is part of the Financial Action Task Force requirements for an FIU to be independent of government, to not take direction such as suggested to investigate specific individuals or specific groups. We have our mandate. We know what we need to do. Our reporting entities are very strong partners, and their due diligence that they provide on a daily basis to monitor these transactions and to work with us to monitor the right transactions have proven to be extremely successful. The regime is set up with 13 different departments and agencies, each of which has a specific mandate, each of which work together in order to enhance and to strengthen the regime in Canada and to ensure that we have what we need to have in order to combat money laundering and terrorist activity financing.
Thank you, Mr. McKillop. I only have a minute left, but would you say, like, if at some future date a government attempted to change your mandate so that government could utilize the information that you gather, would that, in your opinion, it seems that this is what your testimony is saying, would that basically make your organization ineffective at being able to do its job? And would you consider that to be an ethical change if that were to be proposed?
Thank you for the question. I think it would be not my personal view per se, but I think there would be certainly when we were set up looking at the Constitution and what would be constitutionally acceptable in terms of transactions being provided to FinTRAC. And the reason that we can get those transactions, we do not blindly provide these transactions to law enforcement. We have to meet our own threshold in terms of suspecting that it may be relevant to money laundering or terrorist activity financing in order to pass that along as an intelligence disclosure to our partners. So I believe
that's good. That's good. Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's respect of the clock. I now would invite Ms. Damoff. She has 6 minutes for questions and conversation, and the floor is yours, Ms. Damoff.
Thank you so much, Chair. And Mr. McKillop and Ms. Ryan, I want to thank you for coming on such short notice and for the good work that you do at FinTRAC. My first question is, I'm wondering how crowdfunding is captured under your regime at FinTRAC.
Thank you for the question. Crowdfunding itself and the crowdfunding platforms themselves are not, in fact, reporting entities to FinTRAC, so they are not captured within the regime. There was mention earlier about the payment processors that, in fact, process the payments. So something like Stripe or PayPal, when they are doing MSB type activities, and some of these payment processors do have MSB, money service business activities that they participate in. When they do that, they are subject to our legislation, and they're subject to being registered as a money service business, and therefore subject to the compliance program within the PCML TFA. Crowdfunding, however, is not.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then when you're dealing with entities like GoFundMe or GiveSendGo or anyone who's accepting money that's in another country, whether it's the United States or other countries, how do you have information sharing, and how does that work with other countries? Because obviously you're not monitoring financial transactions. You're only monitoring financial transactions in Canada, right?
Well, to clarify, thank you. We don't actually monitor the transactions. It's our reporting entities that monitor the transactions. And crowdfunding platforms themselves are not covered in the US, for example, under FinCEN. Crowdfunding platforms are not covered. However, anybody that's donating to a GoFundMe page, for example, they would donate through a payment processor, which means they would identify themselves. They would need a credit card. They would need to fill in their personal information so that the donation itself may be validated that the funds exist, and then the funds would be transferred to GoFundMe. When GoFundMe is dispersing the money to the particular cause, if they are using a Canadian bank account, that disbursement will go through the Canadian bank account. If our Canadian bank, for example, deemed that disbursement to be suspicious or relevant to money laundering or terrorist financing or IMV activity, they would in fact report suspicious transactions to us. So we don't monitor what GoFundMe may have, but when the disbursement is made through a Canadian bank in the case of Canadian donation pages that have been established. And when a donation page is established, the organizer of that page must also identify themselves, the purpose for the cause, the purpose and the way in which the funding would be dispersed once it's raised.
The part though, is there information sharing between the United States and Canada? So your equivalent in the United States, do you have information sharing between?
In fact, thank you very much for the question. We do, in fact, have 103 or 100 MOUs with international financial intelligence units. So if FinCEN were to receive a SAR, which is a suspicious activity report, which is the equivalency or report, and there's always possibilities for voluntary information records or voluntary submissions of suspicion to FinCEN or to FinTRAC, we would, in fact, and FinCEN would share that intelligence with us. We would then seek permission to further share that information if it met our threshold to our law enforcement or national security agencies, depending on the event. And in fact, FinCEN is our largest partner for the sharing of financial intelligence back and forth, either spontaneously or as a result of a request for information. So it can be done both ways.
Thank you. Probably is my last question. I'll see how much time. Do you that you need to be able to do meaningful compliance? I'm not trying to plug the good work that you do, but I'm sure it gets busier for you and more complicated, and people get. There's a lot of nuances in the work that you do. So I'm just wondering if you have the resources that you need, or if you could do with more.
Thank you very much for the question. As a civil servant, I think anybody would always say, oh, just give us more. But I think the key really to effective compliance is the partnerships that we have developed with our reporting entities. Our reporting entities really do take their role seriously. They see themselves, and they are the front line of money laundering and terrorist financing in Canada. They are the ones that we rely on and the police rely on in terms of investigations and the use of financial intelligence. We continue to modernize our compliance program. We continue to look at a risk-based approach in terms of compliance and our approach to compliance, so that we spend and we use our resources to the most and the best effect that we can to address the highest risk areas and to ensure the compliance with those risk areas. And a lot of the compliance also goes to the education that's provided either through our strategic intelligence, our significant outreach, our significant training, because the better the reporting entities are at understanding what the indicators are and how to report, the better reports we get.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Ms. Michaud, it's your turn. You have 6 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your statement. Mr. McKillop, you were saying in your opening remarks that the social funding sites such as GoFundMe are not among the regulated sectors according to the Money Laundering Act and the Funding of Terrorist Activities Act, and this was implemented in the 2000s. GoFundMe, for example, was created in 2010. Do you think that the current state of law is not adapted to the new reality of the internet and the virtual reality that we're faced with, and that legislative changes are required to make sure that social financing businesses such as GoFundMe be subject to the Act. Answer. Thank you. Inaudible. We're always looking at what we can do to improve. Are there other sectors that should be covered or not covered? But when you think about this, it's really a balance that needs to be struck between the desire to have the most amount of intel possible. Of course, the Deputy Director of Intelligence, I would like to have as much information as possible, but there's a balance that needs to be struck between what is reported to FinTRAC and the private lives and the respect of individuals' privacy and the use of their funding, etc. So there's always a balance that needs to be struck. So we're always looking at sectors that could improve our current regime. I don't necessarily think that we can add sectors because they're being used in a certain way. It depends. It depends if it's a sector that's at risk for terrorist activities or money laundering, and what will happen if they become entities like this. Pages such as GoFundMe, for example, are set up in the U.S., not in Canada, and they're not subject to our Act and vice versa. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do the necessary study to see if there is a way to improve our own regime and to improve the coverage or the use of other sources. We did the same thing with virtual currency or cryptocurrency. This was not covered, and now it is. And they report to us, and we receive reports with regards to cryptocurrency. So we're always trying to improve our system. Thank you. You were talking about having as much intelligence and information as possible. This type of organization is not necessarily subject to the Act. We understand that they themselves have to be of goodwill to send you the information if you're investigating, regardless of the platform or the business. If you see that there's a huge amount of money that's being gathered in a small amount of time, if you see organizations that are affiliated to the extreme right, and that can do this, does this raise any red flags? Do you look at it? Or if there's no information sent to you, you don't necessarily look at it? How does it work? Answer? Well, we always look at what's happening, and our reporting entities, well, as I was saying, there's an intersection between the financial system. So there has to be a bank account used, or there has to be a bank used to share the money that is collected. Our reporting entities do a lot of research in the media. They look at the media each and every day. They know who's involved. They know who the organizers are. They know what's happening in the world. They always check to see if there are people who are known bad actors, let us say. If they're involved, this is always looked at, and they try to submit the information to us. And so there's always a link with the financial system, and this is where we receive reports. We will receive reports if there's a link with funding of terrorism or money laundering. So right now, of course, we're looking at the money that was amassed for the convoy that's now become a siege here in Ottawa in front of the Parliament. So we have this in mind, but looking at other files that you've worked with is the anonymous character of donations, something that, well, according to you, does this open the door to criminal activity or to money laundering when you see all these anonymous donations that are being made? Thank you for the question. The question of anonymity, well, this is a gray zone because the donations are not really anonymous. To make a donation, people have to use a credit card. They have to go through a system such as Stripe, for example, in order to send money to the cause. So it's not really anonymous. What we see publicly is anonymous. We don't see the name of the donor. It appears as anonymous. It's as if during our funding campaign I was to make a donation and I was asked, well, do you want your name to appear? If I say no, it's going to say anonymous, but it's not really anonymous. And the companies such as Stripe or GoFundMe, they know exactly who this is. GoFundMe decided to close the page and to refund the donors. This leads me to believe that they do have all the necessary information on the credit cards and the individuals allowing for refunds. So donations are not truly.
Fascinating point, and maybe a good one to end this particular exchange. Now we'll go to Mr. McGregor, who will have 6 minutes in questions, and the floor is now yours. Mr. McGregor, take it away.
Thank you so much, Chair. The special bulletin that FinTRAC produced on IMVE stated that IMVE threat actors have raised funds through crowdfunding and through accepting donations. And, our Canadian Security Intelligence Service has divided it roughly into four categories. That's xenophobic violence, anti-authoritarian violence, gender-driven violence, and other grievance-driven violence. And of course, our criminal code has a definition of terrorism, which is, an act committed in whole or in part for a political, religious, or ideological purpose, objective, or cause, with the intention of intimidating the public. And the activities recognized as criminal within this context, they can include significant property damage and interference or disruption of essential services, facilities, or systems, which I think any casual observer looking at Ottawa right now could probably make a link. I guess what I'm trying to dig into here is the relationship between the payment service providers like, for example, Stripe and PayPal, the crowdfunding organization, and then the financial entity to which the funds are eventually distributed to. For example, do the payment service providers, do they have information when they're receiving donations? Do they understand or do they, why the donations are coming in? Do they understand for what purpose they're coming in? Does the crowdfunding site have that link with the service provider?
That's a little outside of my lane, but thank you very much for the question. I'm not an expert on the service provision or the service provider or GoFundMe, but my understanding is that the page is set up for a particular cause. People use, when they want to donate, it's a behind the scenes service that's provided. So Stripe, for example, would have the identity of the person that is making the donation. They would have their credit card. They would have all their identification in order to validate that the funds exist and transfer to the particular page. So they would know that it's going to a particular page. My understanding as well is that both Stripe and PayPal, GoFundMe, GiveSendGo, they all have terms of service which they clearly identify that they will not support anything that is related to money laundering, criminal activity, or terrorist financing. Many of these, I would assume, given that they exist in Stripe, for example, in 1 million different companies and hundreds of countries, that they do as well have their own internal compliance program, their own internal media watch program, that they are very socially responsible when it comes to identifying where that money may be going, and I would think not want to process money that were going to a cause that was identified as an illegal cause, for example. But
yeah, that was sort of the essence of my question. I mean, because the financial service company like PayPal, they are required to report to you, but would they understand or would they be able to generate their own intelligence that we know this money was going to a particular crowdfunding site for this cause? Would they be able to generate that intelligence if they thought it was suspicious?
They would, and PayPal and Stripe could, as registered MSBs, they would and could submit reports to us with respect to that.
Ms. Ryan, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I'd like to. I'd like to just point out that the special bulletin that you refer to was produced explicitly by FinTRAC to inform the reporting entities what to look for. Mm-hmm. And we work closely, as my colleague Barry said, with international partners to keep track of emerging trends so that we can feed that back to our private sector partners so that, they know what to look for. And, I would say that the fact that we're able to follow those trends and then feed them back to partners, as you see in the report, shows that there is essentially line of sight to the crowdfunding sector through the PSBs that are reporting to us, through the MSBs that do report to us based on their ability to follow the transactions back to individuals. We can then, look at the relevant patterns and have a sense of, what's suspicious, what raises to the level that our colleagues on the operational side can share with competent authorities. And in that way, that's how the system remains fresh as to, what is suspicious as illicit activity evolves through time.
And just quickly, I've only got 45 seconds. Just, when you are producing actionable intelligence for law enforcement, I know you're not an investigative agency, but you do formulate a lot of your opinions based on the reports you receive. I mean, but do you also passively receive information from other sources? I mean, you see the news every day. You're aware of what's going on. Does that how much does that figure in your reporting to intelligence agencies?
In 10 seconds, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we do open source intelligence in support of the disclosures that we produce, and we will provide that with the disclosures if it's relevant.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, I'm looking at the clock. We have a hard stop at the top of the hour. We have 15 minutes left, and coincidentally and happily, that means that I could call on a representative from each party, and they can take their full allotment of time, and we should end within a minute. So, Mr. Van Popta, you're first. You have 5 minutes. Please proceed.
Good. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. McKillop and Ms. Ryan, for being here and informing us on the important work that you do. I just want some clarification maybe from Mr. McKillop. And that is that if my understanding of your testimony is correct, a crowdfunding platform is not regulated by FinTRAC. So they would never make the report, but it is the money service businesses that are feeding money to the crowdfunding platform, or a bank receiving the money from the crowdfunding platform that are regulated to report suspicious transactions. Is my understanding correct?
That is correct, sir.
Okay, good. So thank you. So, a money service business such as Stripe or PayPal or Visa or MasterCard or whoever it might be, are there clear guidelines as to what they have to look for terrorism type funding or money laundering? What do they look for?
Thank you, sir, for the question. They do have clear guidelines. The guidelines are available and they're on our website. We provide guidelines. We identify as well different reasons perhaps for submitting STRs, and we provide those guidelines. We also provide a number of very specific indicators that would help them in their transaction monitoring. For example, we have 5 very, very successful public-private partnerships dealing with human trafficking, fentanyl trafficking, romance scams, underground banking, child sexual exploitation material on the internet. These PPPs, as we call them, we have set out with our reporting entities, and we provide very actionable indicators that they can plug into their own systems to create the algorithms to assist them in identifying suspicious transactions that may be related to those types of predicate crimes. We've also provided them with terrorist financing indicators, IMVE indicators, as my colleague mentioned, to assist them in identifying those types of transactions. As you know, it's often not simply one transaction, but often a pattern of transactions that's required to look at, and we assist them in providing them as many clear indicators, guidance, outreach, training in order to enhance that. And I think that the success that we've seen is, I think, demonstrable through the increase in our suspicious transaction reports that we've received year over year, as well as the increase in the number of voluntary information records that we've received from the police seeking our assistance in their investigations. As those increase, we've been able to increase our disclosures, and it clearly shows that not only are the reporting entities doing their job really, really well in providing us those reports, but the police and our law enforcement and national security agencies, both in Canada and internationally, significantly appreciate our disclosures and are coming in to get them as often as they possibly can to assist in their investigations.
Good, thank you. Ms. Ryan, I think your hand is up.
It is, sir. I'd like to draw your attention to several international documents that our reporting entities would also consult, which Canada works quite closely to produce. These include, in July of 2019, Terrorist Financing Risk Assessment Guidance; in July of 2021, Ethnically or Racially Motivated Terrorism Financing; and as well, specific documents such as the Financial Action Task Force's best practices on combating the abuse of not-for-profit organizations. So we do work quite closely on a very rich and detailed guidance that is based on.
So I think you've gone on to mute. Okay, good. Okay, thank you. So there's an increase in SARS, suspicious activity reporting. So is that an indication of more suspicious transactions happening, or the reporting entities just getting better at understanding what to look for?
Thank you for the question. And you're right, it is suspicious transaction reporting in Canada. The SARS are in the US. I believe it's a combination of both. It's not that we have, an explosion of criminality necessarily. And better at identifying predicate crimes associated to money laundering and or terrorist financing. And it's the quality of those reports us to do our job, to meet our threshold, and to provide actionable intelligence to our law enforcement national security agencies, both in Canada as well as internationally. As I mentioned, we do have 109 or 110 MOUs with international FIUs that we can share information with.
Thank you very much. And now I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Noor Mohammed. Sir, you have 5 minutes to question. Go ahead.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. McKillop and Ms. Ryan, for joining us. Mr. McKillop, I guess a question for you to start with. You know, we've seen over the course of the last little while a lot of interest from the United States in the funding situation related to GoFundMe and the blockade of Ottawa. You've seen some fairly unsavory characters in the U.S. like Marjorie Taylor Greene weighing in on this. How concerned should Canadians be about foreign funding or foreign funds coming into Canada and spurring on ideologically motivated violent extremism?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. What's happening in Ottawa has not been, to my knowledge, identified as ideologically motivated violent extremism. We might come into Canada to support ideologically motivated violent extremism, and the United States would be extremely concerned about money leaving the States or funding such extremist view or such extremist actions. Our partners in FinCEN are quite alive to this. We share a lot of intelligence back and forth with respect to IMVEs, with respect to traveling people that want to leave the country to participate in terrorist activities, for example. So we do, and we work with our Egmont and our Five Eyes partners very closely with respect to that. So any funding that would be linked to IMVE is of extreme concern and importance to us, and we would disclose that intelligence to our law enforcement and national security partners. So I believe that any action that's taken by those actors or by sanctioned groups, for example, a listed terrorist organization, for example, or members that are, or people that are known to be members of those organizations, both our financial institutions, but also those in the United States, I'm sure, know who these people are. They do monitor their transactions, and they do report actions or completed with respect to them.
So one very brief question then. Do you have any concerns, or have there been any flags raised thus far around potential sources of funding for what has been happening in Ottawa?
Thank you for the question. No, the sources of funding that we've seen today, we have not seen a spike. And as you know, I can't speak to specific reporting or reporting on any individuals or organizations, but we have not seen a spike in suspicious transaction reporting, for example, related to this.
Great, thank you. I'm going to give the rest of my time to Mr. Zuberi, whatever time I have left.
Thank you, Mr. Nur Mohammed, and thank you to witnesses for being here. I just want to ask, zoom out a bit and ask a question related to individuals who might find that their transactions are frozen, international transactions. And these are law-abiding citizens, Canadians, who have no problems at all with the law and are upright citizens. Do they have any recourse when let's say that they're sending money to a family member? Is there any recourse for them to untangle themselves and they believe it's a false positive and that's why their money has been intercepted? Can you inform us about that?
Thank you, sir, for the question. That would not be certainly a role that FinTRAC plays. As I mentioned, we can neither investigate, nor can we seize, nor can we freeze funds, nor do we ask any financial institution to delay a financial transaction. The recourse would be with their own financial institution if, in fact, their funds were put on hold or were frozen. We have seen that happen. It's happened in instances where we see this through some of the suspicious transaction reporting where the narrative, the bank, for example, may tell us that the funds were put on hold until such time as their request for further information was completed and fulfilled by the individual. And then it's really up to the banks and the other financial institutions who have their own, and they determine their own level of risk that they're willing to manage with respect to the accounts and the accounts of their clients. So this would really be something that the individual would have to take up with their own bank and to determine what the risk was that was identified by the bank and how that may be mitigated.
Thank you. And we have about 40 seconds. And related to that, do you provide guidelines along those questions, clarity for banks and other institutions around that?
No, our guidelines are more along the lines of what they need to report to us and how to report, not how to manage their own risk and risk determination, nor how they manage the accounts of their clients.
Thank you very much. And now I'll turn to Ms. Michaud. Ms. Michaud, you have 2.5 minutes.
Merci,
the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You mentioned that your mandate is to fight against money laundering and the funding of terrorist activities. When there are social funding platforms or businesses that are not subject to the Act on the proceeds of crime or the funding of terrorist activities, do you think that this poses problems in Canada's ability to detect and prevent not only money laundering and the funding of terrorist activities, but also foreign interference, given that some platforms or businesses can be based in other countries and money can come from foreign countries as well? Thank you for the question. As I was saying, what we're going through right now is a unique event. We've never seen the use of these platforms as being a place that could be used to facilitate money laundering or funding of terrorism. There is always a risk, but this has not been traditionally a platform that would have been used to these ends. There are many other ways, probably easier ways, to try to launder a cash or to collect money for terrorist activity. So this is a unique event. Are we going to learn from this? Yes. Are discussions underway? Are we going to continue to discuss with our foreign partners? Yes, of course. As you mentioned, these platforms exist on the internet. They're accessible by everyone throughout the world. If someone is supporting a cause, whether it be this cause or another cause, could be helping people who wanted to leave Afghanistan. I would imagine that there were some GoFundMe for that. People from anywhere in the world can support this type of cause by making donations. So I would say that I can't give a percentage, but these social media platforms were useful for collecting money to help people in need throughout the world. So we really have to find a balance between what could be imposed as a burden and the intelligence that could be received.
So now for the last slot, I will turn to Mr. McGregor. You have 2.5 minutes, and you will take us within a minute or two to the top of the clock. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chair. In April of last year, there was a data breach from the Christian crowdfunding site Give, Send, Go. That data breach revealed that there were millions of dollars that had been raised by groups banned from raising funds on other platforms. So they had been banned because of episodes of hate speech and violence that had been used on the platform. Some of the biggest beneficiaries of that had been groups like the Proud Boys, which are a designated terrorist entity. So we only learned of this because of a data breach. I'm just wondering, we as policymakers have to anticipate the new landscape that's before us. Does FinTRAC have what it needs to capture this? Maybe not from a site like GoFundMe, but for other platforms which are competing for this space and for those dollars. Are there gaps that we need to plug as policymakers so that these things can be caught before they end up being just a data breach?
Thank you for your question. Mr. Chair, I think it's always good to ask the question and to do an in-depth study once you're out of a crisis to determine whether or not there are policy gaps that could be looked at and what is the best way to address those. From my perspective right now, in the situation that you mentioned, I've read about the data breach as well. The intersection with the crowdfunding platforms and our financial institutions is a must in order to disperse the money. And if the money were going through a Canadian bank, for example, and directed to the Proud Boys, they're a listed terrorist organization. That money would be stopped by the bank, and we would also get the STR. They cannot, if there's a listed terrorist organization, facilitate the transfer of that money. So it is really the intersection with our banks, and our banks are well aware of those organizations and the individuals associated with those organizations. They know who they are. They have their sanctions list. They do their monitoring, and they do their reporting, and they do it well. So from my perspective, we have that intersection, and raising is likely not helpful to those organizations, but we would get the reporting, or the funding would be stopped by the banks when it comes to those types of organizations trying to receive money.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want to, on behalf of the committee, thank the witnesses for very important and thoughtful testimony this morning. It will be very important as we make through the complexities of these very important and dynamic issues. Colleagues, right on time, thank you very much for everybody's cooperation. Does the committee agree that the meeting should be adjourned? Then the meeting is adjourned. Have a good weekend, everybody. We'll see you on Tuesday. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Chair.